Welcome back to the internet. You have once again started wasting your life watching YouTube. But it doesn't matter because this is not a waste. This is how to get started with Trigger.dev. I'm actually going to break down every step of building out a Trigger workflow because when I started, it took me fucking forever to figure out. I might just be stupid. You know, that could just be me. But let's dive in. I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. By the way, anyone can do this, okay? I wrote it down here. I mean, if you've literally only ever used like Zapier or Make, if you're a script kiddie or a no-code kiddie, you can still use Trigger. It's super easy. Or if you're a programmer with 10 years of experience, you'll still find it helpful. I mean, obviously. And this is literally how I run like all of my logic. All of my clients that come to me, I always at least recommend or mention Trigger just because it's so much easier than setting up like an actual VPS somewhere else or any of the other solutions. You know, especially when you want to scale complexity with no code, it just falls apart. But Trigger, you can do whatever you want. I do recommend watching this video at 1.5 or 2 times speed. And that being said, let's dive in. And just to give you context on how this actually works, this is not Trigger. This is a Supabase Edge function. And I just want you to understand why you could use Trigger. So you could use, you know, something like NAN or Make or Zapier. And if you've used those, obviously you're here because they blow. But this is the other end of the spectrum where you're writing everything in a virtual server. And some of them are persistent. This one is an edge function, so it just shuts down when it's not being used. But what we can see is this is the logs. This is what you get, okay? We have a function. If something goes wrong, you get an error. But this is literally everything you see. Everything that you console log is what you see, and you have no idea which events are from which invocation. It is just kind of a nightmare trying to figure out where things went wrong and actually building out the processes here. And this also lacks a lot of features that Trigger has. But if we come over to Trigger, I'm going to run a little task here, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. So here's my payload that I'm passing into this task, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. But let me run this test, and what we can see is this is the view that you get. Instead of having to look at just the logs, you actually get a breakdown of exactly what steps are running, how long they're taking. So this is a subtask that we're running. This is another subtask that we're running. And everything is broken down and compartmentalized. And it's so much easier to get a visual of what's actually going on in your tasks. And so if anything fails, you'll know instantly. You'll be able to see it rather than finding out later and having to try to recreate the error in an actual kind of edge function. And so as we can see, this process has been completed and we can actually see the output down here. And if you're curious, this is a website that we just generated based off of this information. So if I go here, .webengine.site, what we can see is that website that we just created. So hopefully that answers your question about what Trigger is and why you might want to use it. Now let's dive into what's next, how to get started with Trigger. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a folder, and this is how we're going to set up our project. So what I'm going to do is, this is my developer folder. If you name a folder at the root level, I think, in a Mac with capital D developer, it gets this little hammer icon. It's pretty sick. So anyways, what we're going to do is we'll just type in the project name. So this is going to be Trade Magnet. This is actually for a client. And it looks like I actually already have that set up. But it's an empty directory right now. So all you're going to do is, I'll shut down this and go back, and we're going to change into that directory, okay? And now once you're in this directory, then you can open up your Trigger project. Basically, you just create a project. If you can't figure out how to do that, you're cooked. Don't even try. But once you've created your project, you'll land on a page like this. And this is literally all you need to do to get started. So we're going to copy this first command. It's going to use the npm whatever tool to create a new project and initialize it. So we'll run that in the directory where we actually want to create it. And actually, instead of that, I'm going to create a folder just so I can keep the parts of my app compartmentalized. If I have to do front end and back end, it's just easier to create different folders for each of those and have the node modules and packages and everything separate. So I'll name this workflows. You could name it Trigger. I mean, you could name it poop for all I care. So I'll go into workflows, and then we'll run that command, okay? And so what this is going to do is this is going to basically scaffold out your project and connect you up to that repository or that project. And what it's doing here is you'll see it's adding the node modules, it's installing everything that needs to be installed, and we can just, I'm just going to do trigger for the directory. You can do source/trigger, it doesn't really matter. But let's choose to do a simple hello world sample task, okay? And now that is done, and so if we come into a new VS Code window, we can open up this file, and we'll see our trigger folder with our example task, okay? And this task is just called hello world. And now what we can do is, if you follow the next step on here, you just run this command, npx Trigger.dev at latest dev. What this does is it spins up a local development server. So this means all the code is going to be running on your computer. You don't get charged for it or anything, but it does let you use the interface for Trigger, and it lets you test your tasks extremely easy. This is one of the best testing environments I've ever used, because like when you test stuff locally and then you deploy it, it works exactly the same in production, whereas a lot of things, especially like front-end frameworks, they tend to work slightly differently on your local device than where they do in deployment. You know, it depends where you're deploying, but oftentimes that's where you run into problems, is when you actually try to push. So what you'll see is we have our task here that is within this deployment. And so now let's do some tests, shall we? So what we can do is we have a payload, and I believe this can just be an object, and what we can do is we can pass in a string, which is just going to be a string. Maybe that's a confusing name. We'll call it word. Maybe it needs to look like that. All right, yeah. So what we're doing is we're setting up the payload, and you could actually kind of break this down a little bit if you wanted to, and just make it a little bit easier to read. But this is your payload. So this is what the task is actually going to take in when it starts off. And if we look at that other directory, and this is the task that we just ran at the beginning of this video, and what you can see is I have a type here, which is the create site payload, and this contains a basically list of everything that this task is going to be taking in. Okay, so all we're doing is we're saying the payload is going to be this create site payload. I forgot at the beginning I said this is going to be easy if you've never done code before, and this is literally the first thing I did after like jumping in and learning to code. So it is pretty easy, but there might be a little bit of a learning curve if you're not familiar with TypeScript. So what we're doing here is we're telling the system, basically, it's sort of like a compiler, what type of data this is going to be. So this could, instead of being a string, it could be a number, but if we save that, oh wait, actually that's not going to throw an error. But if we were to change, because we're using the website URL to do something, all right, let me try to throw an error. Okay, so yeah, so as you can see, I changed this payload to be a number, and now it's throwing an error here because this is another trigger task which is expecting a string. And then if we come down, I think this one where we generate the subdomain, it's basically trying to turn that string into a URL, and it can't do it if it's a number. So TypeScript is going to save you. This is like in Zapier when you go to select another variable to put into your next like payload. This is basically the autocomplete for that. It makes everything so much easier, and it prevents you from having a bunch of errors come up. So TypeScript, kind of like JavaScript, just a little bit easier to work with. But back to this project, as we can see, we're doing logger.log. This is like console.log. Basically, it just outputs to the console so you can see what's going on in your task. And all we're doing is we're logging the string that we're bringing in called word, and then we're also logging the context object. And if you hover over this, this will show you what this includes. So with Trigger, you get a lot of different information about the task itself. And you can choose to use this or you can ignore it. You don't actually have to use it, but it can be helpful if you're trying to figure out like how many times your task has failed and if you want to abort after a certain amount of times or take a certain action if it fails a bunch of times. And then we're waiting for 5 seconds. And then another thing, we can just add another logging statement, and we can just say penis poop fart or something very deep like that. And then what we can do is, because we ran this command, this has been getting ready in the background. So this has our testing environment ready. So all you can do is click on test tasks. You can actually just go to the dashboard. You can go to test, and then you can click on your task. And what we're going to do is we'll pass in our payload. So this is going to be word, and then it's going to be poop or some string, right? And then all we have to do is run test. And this is, like I said, on your local computer. And as we can see, it logged hello world, and then it waited for 5 seconds. You can see that took exactly 5 seconds. And then we logged our extremely important penis poop fart. And then if we go to the head of the task, we'll see the output, which was just hello world in this case. This makes it extremely fast to iterate. You can literally just keep like changing things in your task and retrying it. And yeah, I mean, the world is basically your oyster at this point. I mean, you can import, you know, say you want to do, let's do from OpenAI. I think that's what it's called. But yeah, if I had OpenAI installed, you can import OpenAI and use OpenAI or whatever packages you actually want to use. You can bring that in. Okay, so now the last thing that you might be wondering is how the hell do I trigger these tasks, all right? Because up to this point, we've just triggered the task using the dev, and then I also triggered a task manually, but how should you actually trigger these? Well, there's a few different ways to trigger it. One is you could trigger it from your front-end code. Say a user uploads a file and you want to process that file in the background. What you can do is have them upload the file, press a button, and that'll go to an API route where you basically have your private trigger key. You need an API key to be able to start these tasks. And then from that API route, you can start the task and send back to the front end, task started, here's the ID, whatever. You can like check up on the task and return the user a message when it's complete. But what I like to do is I like to set up webhooks because I have a lot of things that are kind of need to be triggered based on webhooks. And how do you do that? Well, Trigger doesn't actually have a built-in facility for handling webhooks. Somewhat unfortunately, although I understand because it's a pain in the ass and it doesn't really relate to this core feature or this core kind of way that Trigger.dev works. And so what you should do instead is you want to set up API routes. I use Supabase for almost every single project that I do. Supabase has edge functions where you can easily set up a webhook, like endpoint, to retrieve your events. Or if you're using Next.js or Svelte or basically any modern framework, you can have a folder called API and you can create a public endpoint there. And then when someone hits that endpoint, you can trigger off your trigger task using your API key. And so hopefully this is a good kind of walkthrough of how to get started setting up Trigger. And then, by the way, so once we're done here, all we can do is we can do npx trigger.dev at latest. This does take a while to type out, but you want to add that at latest at the end. And then you just type deploy. And what this does is it builds everything together, and then it actually deploys your versions to production. So if we go to tasks, well, I guess this... So yeah, so this is just in development right now, but after this deployment finishes, then we'll see that the hello world is also in production. So that's how you actually deploy your tasks, and then you can just get an API key, and you can just basically trigger your tasks from wherever you want. They have really good documentation, and they also have Trigger.dev docs. They also have an AI, so if you just do Command K and you ask, how do I trigger a task from outside of Trigger, then you just hit enter, and the AI knows the docs pretty well, and it'll tell you this. So you just have the Trigger.dev SDK, you import tasks, and then it's basically like a fetch, but less difficult because you set it up with your API key. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple to set it up. You do, want to figure out some way to host your API endpoints or your webhook endpoints, but after that is done. Like, Trigger is just my favorite tool ever, so hopefully this video is helpful.